The Dark Winter. Welcome to Chapter 1, the year the sun died. To understand why this was so terrifying, we have to look at what was happening before everything went wrong. Because here's the thing, early 536 was actually looking pretty good. It was supposed to be a golden age. Over in Europe and the Middle East, the Roman Empire was making a comeback. Well, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. The emperor, a guy named Justinian, was feeling pretty great about himself. He was rich, powerful, and conquering old territories. The capital city, Constantinople, was booming. People were going to the chariot races, arguing about politics, paying their taxes, and complaining about the price of bread. You know, normal human stuff. The sun was shining. The Mediterranean Sea was sparkling blue. If you were a farmer in Italy, you were looking at your grapes and thinking, man, this year's wine is going to be fantastic. Over in China, things were busy too. You had dynasties rising and falling, huge armies marching around, and millions of farmers planting rice. They relied on the seasons like clockwork. Sun comes up, rice grows, everyone eats. Simple. And way over in the Americas, in places like Peru, the most civilization was fishing in the Pacific Ocean. In Mexico, the great city of Teotihuacan was huge, like New York City huge for that time. Everyone all over the globe was just living their lives. They had plans. They had weddings scheduled. They had debts to pay. They assumed that tomorrow would be pretty much the same as today. Because that's the deal we make with nature, right? We plant the seeds, the sun shines, and we get food. It's the basic contract of being alive on Earth. But in the spring of 536, nature tore up the contract. It didn't start with a bang. There was no giant explosion that anyone heard. There wasn't an alien invasion fleet darkening the sky. It started with a fog. But this wasn't your normal morning mist that burns off by noon. This fog was heavy. It was dry. And it was everywhere. Historical records from Italy to the Middle East describe the same creepy thing. The sun changed. The historian Procopius, who was living through this, wrote something that still gives me goosebumps. He said, "For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year." Imagine that. You wake up in the morning, check the window, and it looks like 6 a.m. You wait a few hours. It still looks like 6 a.m. Noon rolls around. Still 6 a.m. The sun was there, but it was just a pale, bluish disk in the sky. You could stare right at it without hurting your eyes. It was like someone had turned the dimmer switch on the entire planet down to about 10%. And then came the shadows, or rather, the lack of them. Because the light was so scattered and weak, shadows disappeared. Everything looked flat. The world lost its depth. It must have felt like living inside a bad video game with the graphic settings turned way down. At first, people were probably just annoyed. Great, another cloudy day. But then days turn into weeks. And weeks turn into months. This mystery fog didn't move. Wind didn't blow it away. Rain didn't wash it out. It just sat there, hugging the ground, choking the light. And then the temperature dropped. Now remember, this started in spring. It's supposed to be getting warmer. But instead of t-shirt weather, people were shivering. In China, there are records of snow falling in August. August. Imagine planning a summer pool party and waking up to a foot of snow. That's not just weird, that's terrifying. In the countryside, the crops stopped growing. Plants need sunlight to do that whole photosynthesis thing, right? Without bright light, they just gave up. Wheat turned yellow and died. Grapes shriveled on the vine. The fruit rotted before it could ripen. The animals sensed it first. You know how dogs get weird before a thunderstorm? Imagine that, but for months. Birds stopped singing because they didn't know when morning was. Roosters probably gave up crowing after a week of perpetual twilight. And this is where the chill part of the story ends and the panic begins. You have to put yourself in their shoes. They didn't have the Weather Channel. They didn't have satellites. They didn't know about volcanic ash or stratospheric aerosols. To the people of 536 AD, there is only one explanation for the sun dying. God is angry. Or the gods. Or the spirits. Take your pick. Every culture assumed they had done something to break the world. In Rome, they probably thought the emperor was a sinner. In China, they whispered that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, basically the divine right to rule. If the emperor was good, the weather was good. If the weather was bad, clearly the guy in charge had to go. People started freaking out. And I don't mean stocking up on toilet paper, freaking out. I mean the apocalypse is literally happening right now, freaking out. Try to imagine the psychological toll. Humans need the sun. It gives us vitamin D. It regulates our sleep. It makes us feel happy. Take that away for a year. Everyone became depressed, lethargic, and terrified. You'd walk through the markets of Constantinople, and it would be hushed. No one was shouting deals. Everyone was just looking up at that sickly, pale blue sun, waiting for it to go out completely. It was the ultimate horror movie setup. But the monster wasn't a zombie or a ghost. The monster was the sky itself. And the scariest part, they were right to be afraid. Because while the darkness was bad, what came next was so much worse. The darkness was just the warning shot. It was the signal that the climate of the earth had snapped. The food was running out. The cold was getting deeper. And in the shadows of this new, dark world, something else was waking up. Something microscopic that loves the cold and loves huge, starving populations. But the people of 536 didn't know that yet. They were just cold, hungry, and standing in the dark, waiting for a dawn that wouldn't come. So, what actually caused the sky to fall? Was it a curse? A meteor? Well, spoiler alert, it was something violent, explosive, and hidden deep in the ice. And to find out what it was, we have to travel to the other side of the world, to a volcano that tore the planet apart. But that is a story for the next chapter. Welcome back. In the last chapter, we left the entire human race standing in the dark. It's the spring of 536 AD, and the sun has basically decided to take a sick day for 18 months. The Romans are terrified. The Chinese are confused. And the most in South America are probably wondering why their prayers aren't working. But today, we are going to step away from the panic for a second. We're going to put on our detective hats. Because this isn't just a horror story. It's a mystery. A whodunit on a planetary scale. Who or what turned off the lights? If you asked a guy in Constantinople back then, he would have told you it was God judging the world. If you asked a Viking, he might have said a wolf ate the sun. But we have something they didn't have, modern science. And thanks to some very smart people digging up ice in Greenland and looking at old tree stumps, we know exactly who the culprit was. It wasn't a god. It wasn't a demon. And it wasn't a meteor, although that would have been pretty cool in a terrifying way. The culprit was a volcano. But not just any volcano. We're talking about an explosion so massive, so violent, and so earth-shattering that it makes modern eruptions look like a science fair baking soda project. This is Chapter 2, The Invisible Volcano. Now, when we think of volcanoes, we usually think of hot lava flowing down a mountain, right? We think of Pompeii, where the danger is right there in front of you. If you're near the volcano, you're in trouble. If you're 1,000 miles away, you're usually fine. You might see it on the news and say, "Wow, that looks scary," and then go back to eating your sandwich. But the eruption of 536 was different. This wasn't a local problem. This was a global event. Scientists call this a colossal volcanic event, and the reason it blocked out the sun has to do with something called the stratosphere. Here is the simple version. The atmosphere has layers. The bottom layer, where we live and breathe, is where weather happens. Rain, wind, clouds, that's all down here. Above that is the stratosphere. It's very calm, very dry, and very stable. Usually, if a volcano erupts, the ash stays in the lower layer. It rains, the rain washes the ash out of the sky, and everything is clean again in a few weeks. But if a volcano is big enough, truly ridiculously energetic, it can shoot its gas and ash straight up, punching through the ceiling into the stratosphere. Once the stuff gets up there, weather can't wash it out. It gets stuck. Specifically, the volcano shoots out tons of sulfur dioxide gas. When that gas hits the stratosphere, it mixes with water vapor and turns into tiny little droplets of sulfuric acid. These droplets form a massive, shiny veil that wraps around the entire planet. Think of it like putting a giant pair of mirrored sunglasses on the Earth. Sunlight hits the mirror and bounces back into space instead of warming the ground. Scientists actually have a score sheet for this. It's called the Dust Veil Index. It sounds like a band name, I know. But the dust veil index is basically a way of measuring how much a volcano messed up the atmosphere. A normal eruption might score a 50 or a 100. The eruption in 536? It broke the scale. It created a veil so thick that it stayed up there for years. So we know what happened. But here is the crazy part. For centuries, nobody knew where it happened. In the history books from 536, nobody mentions an explosion. The Romans didn't say, "Hey, did you hear that loud bang yesterday?" The Chinese didn't write about a mountain blowing its top. This was the invisible volcano. It was a silent killer. For a long time, historians thought maybe it was a volcano in the tropics, maybe in El Salvador or Indonesia. But recently, the evidence has pointed somewhere else. Somewhere cold. The leading theory today is that the offender was likely in Iceland or maybe somewhere in North America. Imagine a mountain in Iceland basically disintegrating. The explosion would have been deafening if you were standing in Scotland or Norway. But for the people in Rome or Constantinople, they were too far away to hear the boom. The sound waves faded out before they reached civilization. But the ash traveled. The jet streams high in the atmosphere grabbed that cloud of death and spread it across the northern hemisphere within days. So the poor Roman farmer didn't get a warning. He didn't hear the explosion. He just woke up one day, looked at the sky, and realized the sun was broken. It's almost scarier that way, isn't it? If you hear a bang, you know something happened. If you just get the silence and the darkness, your imagination starts to run wild. Now let's talk about the temperature, because this is where the dark winter really earns its name. When that volcanic veil covered the earth, the heat stopped coming in. We aren't talking about a chilly afternoon. We are talking about a sudden, violent drop in global temperature. Scientists estimate the world cooled down by about 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius almost overnight. Now, I know what you're thinking. 1 or 2 degrees. That doesn't sound like a big deal. I turn my AC down more than that. But when you're talking about the global average, 2 degrees is catastrophic. It is the difference between a bumper harvest and mass starvation. It was the coldest decade in the last 2,300 years. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine it's summer. You are expecting it to be 85 degrees Fahrenheit, about 30 Celsius. You planted your wheat assuming it would be hot. Instead, the temperature struggles to get past 50 degrees, 10 Celsius. Then, in the middle of July, frost hits. Wheat is tough, but it can't handle freezing temperatures in the middle of summer. The water inside the plant freezes, expands, and bursts the cells. The plant dies instantly. This happened everywhere. From the rice paddies in China to the wheat fields of Egypt to the cornfields in the Americas. The invisible volcano had touched every single meal on the planet. And the scary thing about the dust veil is that it didn't just go away. Usually, a volcano cools the earth for a year or so. But the 536 event was weird. It started a feedback loop. Because it got so cold, the polar ice cap started to grow. Ice reflects sunlight, right? So more ice means more sunlight bouncing away, which makes the Earth even colder, which makes more ice grow. It was a trap. The Earth got stuck in a little ice age of late antiquity. So you have this massive eruption in Iceland or North America. It throws millions of tons of sulfur into the sky. The wind carries it over the greatest empires on Earth. The sun dims. The temperature crashes. The people on the ground had no idea about plate tectonics or sulfur aerosols. They just knew that the summer had turned into winter and refused to turn back. This scientific accident, this one geological bad mood swing, was about to kill millions of people. In the last chapter, we talked about the fear. In this chapter, we talked about the physics. But in the next chapter, we are going to talk about the reality. Because when the crops die, the dinner plates stay empty. And when the dinner plates are empty, civilization starts to crack. The snow is falling in summer. The grain silos are empty. And the hunger is beginning. Welcome to Chapter 3, The Summer That Never Came. You know how summer is supposed to feel. It is the time of year when the world comes alive. The days are long, the sun is hot, and everything is growing. It is the season of abundance. You work hard in the fields, but you know that in a few months, you're going to have a harvest. You're going to have bread, rice, corn, and wine. It is the promise that keeps civilization going. But in 536, nature broke that promise. Let's start in China. The records from this time are incredibly detailed, which makes them even scarier to read. In the province of Qingzhou, it was August. Now, August in China is usually hot and humid. It is the time when the rice paddies are green and lush, soaking up the sun to make the grain that feeds millions of people. But in August of 536, the history books say that yellow dust rained down from the sky like snow. And then the actual snow came. Imagine walking out of your house in shorts and a t-shirt, or the ancient equivalent, a light tunic, expecting to sweat. Instead, you can see your breath in the air. You look at your rice fields, and they aren't green anymore. They are covered in a layer of white frost. Rice is a tropical plant. It loves water and heat. It cannot handle freezing temperatures. So when that snow hit in August, the rice didn't just slow down, it died. Instantly, the stalks turned brown and mushy. The grain inside the husk stopped growing. For a farmer, that is the most heartbreaking sight in the world. That field represents your entire year of work. It represents your family's survival. And in one single night of frost, it's all gone. The chronicles tell us that in some provinces, 70 to 80% of the population died in the famine that followed. That is a number so big it is hard to even wrap your head around. It means that out of every 10 people, only 2 or 3 survive the winter. Now let's fly across the world to the Mediterranean, to the Roman Empire. Here, the disaster looked a little different, but it was just as deadly. In Italy and Greece, life revolved around 3 things: olive oil, wheat, and wine. These weren't just luxuries. They were the fuel of the empire. A Roman soldier ran on bread. A Roman citizen drank wine instead of water because the water could make you sick. But in the summer of 536, the grapes didn't ripen. Grapes need heat to create sugar. Without the sun, the grapes stayed small, hard, and sour. They rotted on the vine before they could turn sweet. That meant no wine for the year. It sounds like a minor inconvenience. I know happy hour is ruined, but back then wine was a source of safe calories. Without it, people were in trouble. And then there was the wheat. Wheat is a little tougher than rice, but it still needs sunlight. The Roman senator Cassiodorus wrote letters during this time that sound incredibly anxious. He talked about how the seasons seemed to be jumbled up. He described the harvest as looking ghostly. The wheat stalks grew, but they were thin and weak. When the farmers went to harvest them, they found that the heads of grain were empty or shriveled. The flour they made was gray and tasted like ash. The price of food skyrocketed immediately. If you were a rich merchant in Constantinople, you could probably afford to buy whatever scraps were left. But if you were a regular person, you were suddenly spending every single coin you had just to buy a loaf of bad bread. Panic started to set in. You would see it in the markets. People pushing and shoving for a bag of grain. Neighbors who used to be friends started hiding their food from each other. The social trust that holds a city together began to evaporate. But the cold wasn't the only problem. While the northern hemisphere was freezing, other parts of the world were drying out. Let's go to South America, to the coast of Peru. This was the home of the Moche civilization. These guys were master engineers. They had built incredible irrigation canals to bring water from the mountains down to their desert cities. They were experts at farming in a tough environment. But the volcanic eruption messed up the global wind patterns. It disrupted the monsoons and the El Niño cycles. Instead of rain, the Moche got dust. The rivers that fed their canals started to shrink. The water level dropped lower and lower until it was just a muddy trickle, and then nothing. The Moche priests probably tried everything. They sacrificed animals, they burned incense, they prayed to the decapitator god. Yes, that was a real god they had, and he was as scary as he sounds. But the rain didn't come. The corn dried up in the fields. The sand blew over the farmlands, reclaiming the green strips of civilization. It's a different kind of horror from the snow in China, but the result was the same: empty bellies. And we can't forget the animals. Humans can store food. We can pickle things, dry things, salt things. We can plan ahead. Animals can't. When the snow fell in summer and the grass died, the livestock had nothing to eat. Cows, sheep, and goats started dropping like flies. This was a double disaster. First, because people relied on them for milk and meat. But second, and maybe more importantly, these animals were the tractors of the ancient world. An ox pulls the plow. A horse carries the goods to market. A donkey turns the millstone to grind the grain. When the animals died, the entire engine of the economy stopped working. You couldn't plant the next season's crops because you didn't have an ox to pull the plow. You couldn't move food to the starving cities because the horses were too weak to walk. The countryside became eerily quiet. No mooing cows, no bleating sheep, just the sound of the wind hissing through the dead grass and the crunch of frost underfoot. And then the hunger truly set in. Real starvation is a slow, ugly process. It's not just your stomach growling. It changes the way you think. Your body goes into survival mode. You become lethargic. Your brain gets foggy. You stop caring about anything other than food. In the cities, the poor were the first to suffer. They ate the bad bread, then they ate the weeds growing in the cracks of the pavement, and then they ate things I won't mention here. In the countryside, people tried to eat tree bark mixed with a little bit of flour. They boiled leather to try and get some nutrients out of it. It was a desperate, clawing fight for survival. And remember, all of this was happening in the dark. The sun was still that pale, blue ghost in the sky. It felt like nature was mocking them. You were freezing, you were starving, and you couldn't even feel the warmth of the sun on your face to give you a little bit of hope. The summer of 536 wasn't just a bad harvest. It was a complete biological collapse. The plants died, the animals died, and the humans were next in line. But here is the thing about humans, we don't just sit there and die quietly. When people are hungry, they get angry. And when they get angry, they look for someone to blame. The emperors and kings sitting in their palaces were about to find out that a starving population is more dangerous than any invading army. The environment had collapsed, and now the great empires of the world were about to crumble right along with it. The darkness had destroyed the food. Now it was coming for the thrones. In the next chapter, we are going to leave the fields and go into the palaces. We are going to see how the most powerful man in the world, Emperor Justinian, watched his dreams of glory turn into a nightmare of shadows. So we have talked about the darkness in the sky, and we have talked about the massive volcanic explosion that caused it. But now we need to talk about what that actually felt like on the ground. Because for the people living in 536 AD, the science didn't matter. The atmospheric physics didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was one simple, terrifying fact. Summer had been canceled. Welcome to Chapter 3, the summer that never came. You know, how summer is supposed to feel. It is the time of year when the world comes alive. The days are long, the sun is hot, and everything is growing. It is the season of abundance. You work hard in the fields, but you know that in a few months, you're going to have a harvest. You're going to have bread, rice, corn, and wine. It is the promise that keeps civilization going. But in 536, nature broke that promise. Let's start in China. The records from this time are incredibly detailed, which makes them even scarier to read. In the province of Qingzhou, it was August. Now, August in China is usually hot and humid. It is the time when the rice paddies are green and lush, soaking up the sun to make the grain that feeds millions of people. But in August of 536, the history books say that yellow dust rained down from the sky like snow. And then the actual snow came. Imagine walking out of your house in shorts and a t-shirt, or the ancient equivalent, a light tunic, expecting to sweat. Instead, you can see your breath in the air. You look at your rice fields, and they aren't green anymore. They are covered in a layer of white frost. Rice is a tropical plant. It loves water and heat. It cannot handle freezing temperatures. So when that snow hit in August, the rice didn't just slow down, it died. Instantly, the stalks turned brown and mushy. The grain inside the husk stopped growing. For a farmer, that is the most heartbreaking sight in the world. That field represents your entire year of work. It represents your family's survival. And in one single night of frost, it's all gone. The chronicles tell us that in some provinces, 70 to 80% of the population died in the famine that followed. That is a number so big it is hard to even wrap your head around. It means that out of every 10 people, only 2 or 3 survive the winter. Now let's fly across the world to the Mediterranean, to the Roman Empire. Here, the disaster looked a little different, but it was just as deadly. In Italy and Greece, life revolved around 3 things: olive oil, wheat, and wine. These weren't just luxuries. They were the fuel of the empire. A Roman soldier ran on bread. A Roman citizen drank wine instead of water because the water could make you sick. But in the summer of 536, the grapes didn't ripen. Grapes need heat to create sugar. Without the sun, the grapes stayed small, hard, and sour. They rotted on the vine before they could turn sweet. That meant no wine for the year. It sounds like a minor inconvenience. I know happy hour is ruined, but back then wine was a source of safe calories. Without it, people were in trouble. And then there was the wheat. Wheat is a little tougher than rice, but it still needs sunlight. The Roman senator Cassiodorus wrote letters during this time that sound incredibly anxious. He talked about how the seasons seemed to be jumbled up. He described the harvest as looking ghostly. The wheat stalks grew, but they were thin and weak. When the farmers went to harvest them, they found that the heads of grain were empty or shriveled. The flour they made was gray and tasted like ash. The price of food skyrocketed immediately. If you were a rich merchant in Constantinople, you could probably afford to buy whatever scraps were left. But if you were a regular person, you were suddenly spending every single coin you had just to buy a loaf of bad bread. Panic started to set in. You would see it in the markets. People pushing and shoving for a bag of grain. Neighbors who used to be friends started hiding their food from each other. The social trust that holds a city together began to evaporate. But the cold wasn't the only problem. While the northern hemisphere was freezing, other parts of the world were drying out. Let's go to South America, to the coast of Peru. This was the home of the Moche civilization. These guys were master engineers. They had built incredible irrigation canals to bring water from the mountains down to their desert cities. They were experts at farming in a tough environment. But the volcanic eruption messed up the global wind patterns. It disrupted the monsoons and the El Niño cycles. Instead of rain, the Moche got dust. The rivers that fed their canals started to shrink. The water level dropped lower and lower until it was just a muddy trickle, and then nothing. The Moche priests probably tried everything. They sacrificed animals, they burned incense, they prayed to the decapitator god. Yes, that was a real god they had, and he was as scary as he sounds. But the rain didn't come. The corn dried up in the fields. The sand blew over the farmlands, reclaiming the green strips of civilization. It's a different kind of horror from the snow in China, but the result was the same: empty bellies. And we can't forget the animals. Humans can store food. We can pickle things, dry things, salt things. We can plan ahead. Animals can't. When the snow fell in summer and the grass died, the livestock had nothing to eat. Cows, sheep, and goats started dropping like flies. This was a double disaster. First, because people relied on them for milk and meat. But second, and maybe more importantly, these animals were the tractors of the ancient world. An ox pulls the plow. A horse carries the goods to market. A donkey turns the millstone to grind the grain. When the animals died, the entire engine of the economy stopped working. You couldn't plant the next season's crops because you didn't have an ox to pull the plow. You couldn't move food to the starving cities because the horses were too weak to walk. The countryside became eerily quiet. No mooing cows, no bleating sheep, just the sound of the wind hissing through the dead grass and the crunch of frost underfoot. And then the hunger truly set in. Real starvation is a slow, ugly process. It's not just your stomach growling. It changes the way you think. Your body goes into survival mode. You become lethargic. Your brain gets foggy. You stop caring about anything other than food. In the cities, the poor were the first to suffer. They ate the bad bread, then they ate the weeds growing in the cracks of the pavement, and then they ate things I won't mention here. In the countryside, people tried to eat tree bark mixed with a little bit of flour. They boiled leather to try and get some nutrients out of it. It was a desperate, clawing fight for survival. And remember, all of this was happening in the dark. The sun was still that pale, blue ghost in the sky. It felt like nature was mocking them. You were freezing, you were starving, and you couldn't even feel the warmth of the sun on your face to give you a little bit of hope. The summer of 536 wasn't just a bad harvest. It was a complete biological collapse. The plants died, the animals died, and the humans were next in line. But here is the thing about humans: we don't just sit there and die quietly. When people are hungry, they get angry. And when they get angry, they look for someone to blame. The emperors and kings sitting in their palaces were about to find out that a starving population is more dangerous than any invading army. The environment had collapsed, and now the great empires of the world were about to crumble right along with it. The darkness had destroyed the food. Now it was coming for the thrones. In the next chapter, we are going to leave the fields and go into the palaces. We are going to see how the most powerful man in the world, Emperor Justinian, watched his dreams of glory turn into a nightmare of shadows. Join me in Chapter 4 as we witness Constantinople in Twilight. We have looked at the science, and we have looked at the starving farmers in the fields. But now we need to go to the big city. We need to go to the place where the decisions were made. Welcome to Chapter 4, Constantinople in Twilight. If you live in the year 536, Constantinople wasn't just a city. It was the city. It was the New York of the ancient world. It was the capital of the Roman Empire, well, the eastern half anyway, and it was rich, loud, and incredibly powerful. This was the center of the universe. It was where the silk from China met the spices from India and the gold from Africa. It had paved streets, massive aqueducts, and a population of 500,000 people. And sitting on top of this golden anthill was a man named Justinian. History calls him Justinian the Great, and honestly, the guy earned the nickname. He wasn't the kind of emperor who sat around eating grapes all day. He was a workaholic. He was obsessed with one big idea: make Rome great again. He wanted to take back the lost territories in Italy and Africa. He wanted to rewrite all the laws. He wanted to build the biggest, coolest churches the world had ever seen. He was a man with a plan, and up until 536, the plan was working perfectly. But there is an old saying, man plans and God laughs. Or in this case, God turns out the lights. Imagine being Justinian in the spring of 536. You wake up in the Great Palace. You have armies marching in Italy. You have architects drawing up blueprints. You have tax collectors counting coins. You are the CEO of the biggest company on earth. And then you look out the window, and the sun is wrong. At first, Justinian probably thought what everyone else thought. It's just a cloudy week. He probably told his generals to keep marching and his architects to keep building. But as the weeks turned into months, the mood in the palace shifted from annoyance to genuine fear. Running an empire is really just a complicated logistics game. You need three things: money, food, and morale. The darkness killed all three. Let's talk about the food first. Constantinople didn't grow its own food. A city that big needs to import massive amounts of grain every single day, mostly from Egypt. They had these huge grain ships that would sail across the Mediterranean to feed the people. But remember the cold, the storms, the dying crops? Suddenly, the grain shipments started getting smaller. The bread that the government gave out for free, which kept the poor people from rioting, started to run out. Justinian was a smart guy. He knew that if the people were hungry, they wouldn't care about his glorious conquests in Italy. They would care about the empty bakery shelves. So the emperor found himself in a nightmare scenario. He had to pause his wars because he couldn't feed his soldiers. You can't march on an empty stomach, and you definitely can't fight a battle when you are shivering in summer snow. The great machine of the Roman Empire, which had been running smoothly for centuries, ground to a halt. Now let's walk down the streets of the city. Usually, Constantinople was a noisy place. You would hear merchants shouting, wheels clattering, and thousands of people arguing in Greek. But in the twilight of 536, the city went quiet. It was an eerie, muffled silence. It was too cold to stand outside and gossip. The famous Hippodrome, where they held massive chariot races with 100,000 screaming fans, became a lot less fun. Who wants to sit on a cold stone bench watching horses run in the fog? The energy of the city just drained away. And we have to talk about the scribes. These were the guys whose job it was to write everything down. They were the journalists of the ancient world. The most famous one was a guy named Procopius. He was basically Justinian's personal secretary and historian. And if you read his writings from this time, you can feel his confusion. Procopius was a smart, educated man. He knew his astronomy. He knew how the sun was supposed to work. But he looked at the sky in 536 and basically wrote, "I have no idea what is happening, and I am terrified." He wrote about how the sun cast no shadows. He wrote about the dread that hung over the city. Imagine being a scribe in a room lit by candles at noon. You're trying to write the official history of the glorious emperor, but outside, the world looks like it is ending. It must have felt pointless. Why write down history if there is no future? But there is one specific image that really captures this moment for me. At this exact time, Justinian was building his masterpiece, the Hagia Sophia. This was going to be the biggest church in the world. A massive dome that seemed to float in the air. It was supposed to be a symbol of light and God's glory. But in 536, it was a construction site. Imagine the workers climbing up the scaffolding, shivering in the cold wind. They are trying to place the bricks for this giant cathedral, but they can barely see what they are doing because the sun is so dim. They are building a church of holy wisdom in a world that seems to have lost all reason. Inside the unfinished shell of the church, it must have been pitch black. They would have had to use torches and lamps all day long just to see their own hands. The irony is tragic. Justinian wanted to build a temple of light, and instead, he was building it during the darkest year in history. The lamps flickering in the vast darkness of the Hagia Sophia are a perfect symbol for the whole empire. A tiny little bit of human hope trying to push back against a massive, overwhelming gloom. And the pressure on Justinian must have been crushing. In the ancient world, the emperor wasn't just a political leader. He was the link between God and the people. If the sun went out, it was technically his fault. He probably spent his nights pacing the halls of the palace, praying, asking for a sign, asking for the light to come back. He probably had priests chanting 24/7. He probably threw money at every church in the city. But the sky didn't care. The fog didn't lift. And slowly, the realization set in that the restoration of the empire was over. You can't restore an empire when the planet itself is broken. The taxes dried up because the farmers had no crops to sell. The army weakened because the supply lines froze. The people grew sullen and quiet, huddled around fires in their homes, waiting for the end. Constantinople, the queen of cities, became a city of ghosts. But the worst part, the darkness was actually protecting them. That sounds weird, right? How could the freezing cold and the dark be a good thing? Well, because the cold kept people inside. It slowed down travel. It kept things isolated. But as the months dragged on, the ecosystems of the world started to shift. The rats in the countryside were getting cold too. They were getting hungry too. And they were looking for a warm place to live. A place with a lot of people and a lot of garbage. They started moving toward the cities. And they weren't coming alone. Riding on the backs of those rats were tiny fleas. And inside those fleas was a bacteria that had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Justinian thought the darkness was the worst thing that could happen to his reign. He thought the famine was the bottom of the barrel. He was wrong. The darkness had weakened the population. It had made them hungry, cold, and crowded together indoors. It had set the perfect stage for the real killer to arrive. The sun would eventually come back. The fog would eventually clear. But what came out of the fog would change the world more than any volcano ever could. The pale horse was riding toward Constantinople, and it was bringing the plague. Join me in Chapter 5 as we meet the invisible enemy. We have survived the volcano. We have survived the darkness. We have survived the freezing summer and the empty plates. By the time we get to the year 540 or 541 AD, things are actually starting to look, well, not good, but stable. The sun was back to its normal brightness. The crops were growing again. Emperor Justinian was probably thinking, okay, phew, the worst is over. We can get back to normal. But remember what I said earlier about the universe having a dark sense of humor? Just when humanity started to stand up and dust itself off, the universe came back with a steel chair. Welcome to Chapter 5, The Pale Horse. To understand this next disaster, we have to look at biology. Specifically, the biology of something very small and very furry. When the world got super cold during the dark winter, it didn't just hurt humans. It messed up the animals too. In the wild grasslands of Africa and Asia, wild rodents like gerbils and marmots were freezing. Their food sources died out. So what do you do if you are a cold, hungry wild rat? You move. You migrate towards warmth and food. And where is the best place to find warmth and food? Human cities. It was a massive, silent migration. Millions of wild rodents moved out of the wilderness and closer to human farms and villages. And when they did, they met up with the local city rats, the black rats. Now, usually, rats hanging out together is just gross. But this time, it was deadly. Because the wild rodents were carrying a passenger. Tiny flea. And inside that flea was a bacteria that had been sleeping in the wild for a long time. Scientists call it Yersinia pestis. You probably know it by its street name, the plague, the Black Death. So the wild rats gave the fleas to the city rats. And the city rats? They were about to go on a trip. Let's talk about the grain ships. I mentioned before that Constantinople was huge. 500,000 people. To feed that many people, you need a mountain of bread every single day. The Roman Empire had a massive shipping network that brought wheat from Egypt, which was the breadbasket of the world, all the way up to Constantinople. These ships were massive. They were the super tankers of the ancient world. They were filled to the brim with delicious golden wheat. And guess who loves wheat? Rats. So these rats, infected with the plague, sneaked onto the ships in Egypt. They burrowed into the grain. They had a great time. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet cruise across the Mediterranean. These ships were supposed to be the ships of life. They were bringing food to a starving empire. But without knowing it, the sailors were actually transporting a biological bomb. The first explosion happened in a city called Pelusium in Egypt. It started weirdly. People noticed that the rats were acting strange. They were coming out in the middle of the day, spinning around and dying on the streets. It was creepy, but nobody knew what it meant. Then the humans started getting sick. But this wasn't a normal flu. It hit you like a truck. You would wake up feeling a little feverish. By lunch, you were burning up. You would start hallucinating, seeing ghosts, monsters, or hearing voices. And then came the buboes. That's where the name bubonic plague comes from. Painful, black swellings would appear in your armpits, your neck, or your groin. They would grow to the size of an orange. It was agonizing. Once the buboes appeared, you had a few days, maybe less. Your body would turn black as the tissue died gangrene. And then, lights out. In Pelusium, people started dropping dead so fast they couldn't bury them. But news traveled slow back then. There was no Twitter to say, hey, stay away from Egypt, there is a zombie virus loose. So the grain ships kept sailing. They sailed north, across the sparkling blue sea, heading for the capital of the world. Picture this scene. It is a sunny morning in Constantinople. The dock workers are happy because the grain fleet is arriving. Yay, bread. We aren't going to starve. The ship's dock. The ropes are tied. The gangplanks come down. The sailors carry the sacks of grain off the ship. But running down the ropes, scurrying into the shadows of the docks, are the rats. They moved into the warehouses. They moved into the bakeries. They moved into the walls of the houses. And the fleas jumped. A flea bites a rat. The rat dies. The flea gets hungry. It looks for the next warm body. It smells a human. It jumps. Chomp. That little bite was the seal of doom for the Roman Empire. At first, in Constantinople, it was a trickle. A few people in the harbor district got sick. The doctors probably said, oh, it's just a bad fever. Drink some water and rest. But then the neighbors got sick. Then the priest who visited them got sick. Then the baker down the street got sick. The bacteria Yersinia pestis is terrifyingly good at what it does. It attacks the lymph nodes. It shuts down your immune system. And it is highly contagious in crowded places. And remember, Constantinople was crowded. People lived in apartment blocks called insulae, packed in like sardines. The sanitation wasn't exactly modern. It was a playground for the plague. The realization didn't hit everyone at once. It was a slow, creeping horror. People started whispering. Have you seen the swellings? Did you hear about the merchant's family? All dead in 2 days. The grain ships of death kept arriving, bringing more food and more rats, fueling the fire. It is ironic, isn't it? The very thing they needed to survive, the food, was the vehicle that brought their destruction. It's like ordering a pizza and the delivery driver is the Grim Reaper. Emperor Justinian was sitting in his palace, planning his next war. He was still trying to fix the economy after the Dark Years. He had no idea that an enemy had already breached the city walls. An enemy that no sword could kill and no wall could stop. This was the second apocalypse. The first one, the darkness, was an environmental disaster. It broke the sky. This second one was a biological disaster. It broke the body. The psychological impact of this 1-2 punch is hard to imagine. The people of that time truly believed the world was ending. First the sun goes out, and now a pestilence is melting people from the inside out. If you were a religious person in 541 AD, you weren't thinking bacteria. You were thinking the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You saw the pale horse riding through the streets, and its rider was death. The fear in the city changed. During the darkness, the fear was a quiet, cold depression. During the plague, the fear was frantic. It was panic. People stopped going to work. Mothers abandoned their sick children because they were too afraid to touch them. The rich fled to their country estates, only to find the rats were already there. There was nowhere to run. The city of Constantinople, the jewel of the world, was about to become a graveyard. The scribes tell us that the death toll started low. A few dozen a day, then 100, then 500, and then the numbers went vertical. The systems of the city, the police, the burial guilds, the government, were about to be overwhelmed. The order of civilization was about to snap. In the next chapter, we are going to walk through the streets of hell. We are going to see what happens when a city of 500,000 people starts dying at a rate of 5,000 a day. We will see the emperor himself fall ill, and the smell of death cover the Golden Horn. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a collapse. Get your hazmat suits ready, because we are going into the quarantine zone. Join me in Chapter 6, A City of Ghosts. We have arrived at the darkest part of the story. If the dark winter was the opening act, and the arrival of the rats was the build-up, then Chapter 6 is the horror movie climax. We are in Constantinople. The year is 542 AD. The plague has moved from the docks into the living rooms, the bedrooms, and the palaces. Welcome to Chapter 6, A City of Ghosts. I want you to try and imagine the scale of what happened here. Modern historians estimate that at the peak of the plague, about 5,000 people were dying in Constantinople every single day. Some sources say it went as high as 10,000 a day. Just pause and think about that number. That is a small stadium full of people, wiped out every 24 hours. The city had a population of maybe 500,000. So every day, 2% of the city was disappearing. If that happened in New York City today, it would mean 160,000 people dying daily. At first, the city tried to handle it. The Romans were organized people. They had rules. They had funeral rites. When someone died, you washed the body, you said prayers, you buried them in a cemetery outside the walls. It was respectful. It was civilized. But within a few weeks, civilization broke. There were simply too many bodies and not enough living people to bury them. The gravediggers caught the plague and died. The priests who said the prayers caught the plague and died. The family members who carried the coffins. You get the picture. The system was overwhelmed. Procopius, our guy on the ground, wrote that the city gates were clogged with funeral processions. It was like a traffic jam of death. But eventually, even the processions stopped. People stopped burying their dead. They just put them outside. Imagine walking down the main street. The beautiful paved road called the Misi, where merchants used to sell spices and silk. Now, it is lined with corpses. They are stacked up like firewood. Rich people, poor people, soldiers, beggars, the plague didn't care. In death, everyone looked the same. The smell must have been indescribable. Remember, the weather was still weird. It was damp and cold. The mystery fog had lifted a bit, but the air was still heavy. So you have the smell of thousands of decaying bodies mixing with a cold, wet fog from the sea. It hung over the city like a toxic cloud. People walked around pressing handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar to their noses, hoping it would filter out the sickness. Spoiler, it didn't. And the sound, or rather, the silence. Usually, a city is full of noise. Carts, shouting, construction. But now, the only sound was the wailing of mourners from behind closed shutters. And then even the wailing stopped because people were too weak or too depressed to cry anymore. The historian John of Ephesus wrote, "Nobody would go out of doors without some urgent necessity. It was a ghost town, inhabited by the living who looked like the dead." But here is where it gets truly horrific. The government had a problem. What do you do with 10,000 bodies a day? You can't dig graves fast enough. The ground is hard. The workers are sick. So Emperor Justinian, who was still trying to run things, ordered a desperate solution. Across the Golden Horn, the harbor, there was a fortress district called Psyche, modern-day Galata. There were old defensive towers there. The officials ripped the roofs off the towers, and they started throwing the bodies inside, just filling them up, like filling a grain silo, but with people. They filled these massive stone towers until the bodies reached the top, and then they put the roofs back on. Procopius says that when the wind blew from that direction, the smell was so bad that people in the main city would vomit in the streets. It was a nightmare factory. When the towers were full, they turned to the sea. They loaded bodies onto boats, sailed them out into the middle of the currents, and dumped them. But the sea is unpredictable. The currents swirled back. The next morning, thousands of bodies washed up on the shores of the city, a ring of death surrounding the capital. It sounds like I am making this up for a zombie movie script, but this is historical record. This actually happened to real people who had jobs and crushes and favorite foods just like us. And the psychological trauma. It shattered them. Social rules evaporated. Money became meaningless. You could find a bag of gold on the street and no one would pick it up. What's the point of gold if you're going to be dead by Tuesday? Thieves stopped stealing. Merchants stopped selling. The only currency was survival. People became incredibly paranoid. Some thought that if they said the name of the disease, it would come for them. Others thought demons were walking the streets. There were reports of people seeing black spirits knocking on doors. If you opened the door, you died. It was mass hysteria. And then the unthinkable happened. The one person who was supposed to be safe. The one person who was chosen by God to lead them. The emperor himself got a lump on his leg. Justinian caught the plague. The news must have hit the city like a bomb. If the emperor isn't safe, nobody is safe. The most powerful man on earth, the guy with the best doctors, the best food, and the thickest walls, was down for the count. He fell into a deep coma. He was delirious. He was hallucinating. The doctors probably tried to bleed him or give him strange herbal potions, but back then, medicine was basically a guessing game. For weeks, the empire effectively had no leader. It was headless. Rumors started flying. The emperor is dead. The army is taking over. The Persians are invading. The generals started arguing about who would be the next emperor. They were literally measuring the drapes while Justinian was fighting for his life in the other room. But here is a little twist. Justinian didn't die. He was one of the rare, lucky few who survived the infection. He woke up. But the history books say he was different. The plague had changed him. He was weaker. He was more paranoid. Some say he became cruel. The energetic, ambitious visionary who wanted to fix the world was gone. In his place was a scarred survivor who had seen the face of hell. When he finally recovered and looked out at his city, what did he see? He saw a ruin. The economy was destroyed. The army was decimated. The tax base was dead. The farmers who grew the wheat were dead. The bakers who baked it were dead. The dream of restoring the Roman Empire died in those hospital towers across the harbor. The plague raged in Constantinople for 4 months. By the time it burned itself out, nearly 40% of the city's population was gone. Imagine your friends list on social media. Now delete almost half of them. That was the reality. And it wasn't just Constantinople. The plague traveled along the Roman roads, those famous roads that were the pride of the empire. It hit Antioch. It hit Rome. It hit Marcella. It hit London. It was the first true pandemic in recorded history. As the bodies were cleared away and the survivors crawled out of their homes, they looked around at a world that was empty. There was plenty of food now because there were fewer mouths to eat it. There was plenty of land because the owners were dead. The silence we talked about earlier, it became permanent. The noisy, bustling, crowded world of antiquity was gone. The quiet, localized, survivalist world of the Middle Ages was beginning. But while the humans were dying, something else was happening on the borders. The enemies of Rome were watching. They saw the weakness. They saw the empty forts. They saw the sick soldiers. And they decided it was time to move. The darkness had broken the climate. The plague had broken the people. Now the wolves were coming to break the borders. In the next chapter, we are going to leave the city of the dead and go to the edge of the empire. We're going to see how the starvation and the cold triggered a massive game of musical chairs among the barbarian tribes. The Huns, the Avars, and the Turks are on the move. And they are hungry too. Join me in Chapter 7, The Starving East. We have spent a lot of time in Europe and the Mediterranean. We watched the Romans freeze, we watched them starve, and we watched them get sick. It's been a rough ride for Emperor Justinian. But while the West was dealing with rats and plague towers, the East was facing a different kind of nightmare. Welcome to Chapter 7, The Starving East. If you zoomed out on a map in the year 536 AD, you would see that the Roman Empire wasn't the only superpower in town. all the way across the Silk Road, China was in the middle of the northern and southern dynasties period. Now, usually when we think of ancient China, we think of stability. We think of the Great Wall, efficient bureaucrats, and tea ceremonies. We think of a society that runs like a Swiss watch. But in the late 530s, that watch got smashed with a hammer. The same volcanic cloud that covered Europe also drifted over Asia. But because of the way the jet streams work, it hit China a little differently. In Europe, it brought damp, freezing cold. In China, it brought the cold, but it also brought the drought. And then, it brought the yellow dust. The Chinese chronicles from this time are very specific. They talk about a yellow fog or yellow dust that fell from the sky like rain. Now imagine that. You are a farmer in the Yellow River Valley. You are used to seeing rain. You want rain. But instead, you look up and the sky is vomiting dust. It coats your house, your clothes, and your food. It tastes like dirt. It grits between your teeth. This wasn't magical fairy dust. Scientists today think this was vast amounts of topsoil being blown off the drying lands of Central Asia. The drought was so bad that the earth itself was turning into powder and blowing away. And if the soil is blowing away, what isn't happening? Farming. The chronicles report that in the summer of 536, frost killed the crops. We talked about the snow in August back in chapter 3. But in the years that followed, the drought finished what the frost started. In the province of Xi'an, which was a huge population center, the reports say that people ate each other. I know it's gruesome, but we have to be honest about history. When a society runs out of food completely, the rules of being human stop applying. The yellow dust wasn't just annoying weather, it was a death sentence for the land. But in China, a famine isn't just a humanitarian crisis. It's a political crisis. See, the emperors of China ruled by something called the Mandate of Heaven. This was a cosmic contract. It went like this: the emperor is the son of heaven. As long as he is virtuous and does a good job, heaven will bless the land with good weather and good harvests. But if the emperor is corrupt, or lazy, or bad, heaven will get angry. And how does heaven show its anger? By sending natural disasters. So when the sun went dim, the snow fell in summer, and the yellow dust choked the fields, the people didn't blame the volcano. They didn't blame the atmospheric pressure. They looked at the emperor and said, "This is your fault." The political stability of the Northern Wei dynasty evaporated. The emperor was suddenly seen as illegitimate. He had lost the mandate. And when an emperor loses the mandate, it is the duty of the people and the ambitious generals to remove him. So, on top of the starvation, you had civil war. The Northern Wei dynasty, which had ruled for over 100 years, cracked apart. It split into the Eastern Wei and the Western Wei. Warlords seized power. Armies marched across fields that were already dead, stealing the last scraps of food from the peasants. It was chaos. The meticulous records of the Chinese court turned into lists of disasters. Stars fell. The earth shook. The rivers dried up. And speaking of drying rivers, let's move a little bit west, towards Persia and the Near East. This was the home of the Sassanid Empire. These guys were the arch-rivals of the Romans. They were powerful, rich, and sophisticated. But the drought hit them just as hard. The great rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris, and the Euphrates are the lifeblood of that region. Without them, you live in a desert. During the climatic shock of the 530s, the water levels dropped. The intricate irrigation systems that had worked for thousands of years stopped working. The Garden of Eden turned into a dust bowl. This created a massive pressure cooker. When people can't eat where they are, they don't just sit down and die. They move. We start to see mass migrations. People from the countryside flooded into the cities, just like in Rome. But the cities had no food either. So then people started moving across borders. Tribes from the steppes, facing the same cold and drought, started looking at the settled empires and thinking, I bet they have food. This is the beginning of the Great Volcano, or the migration of peoples that would reshape the map of Asia and Europe. The Avars, the Turks, the tribes of the steppe, they were all pushed into motion by the hunger. It's like a line of dominoes. The volcano pushed the climate. The climate pushed the food supply. The lack of food pushed the people. And the people pushed the empires off a cliff. But there is one specific story from the Chinese records that really sticks with me. It's a small detail, but it breaks your heart. During the height of the famine, the emperor of the crumbling northern way tried to hold a traditional ceremony to pray for rain. He put on his ceremonial robes, he went to the altar, and he performed the rituals perfectly. He did everything right. And while he was praying, the yellow dust kept falling. It's such a powerful image of helplessness. All the power, all the tradition, all the authority of the state meant absolutely nothing against the raw power of the planet. The dynasty fell shortly after. The dark winter didn't just change the weather in the east, it changed the history books. It ended lines of kings that had ruled for centuries. It broke the faith people had in their governments, and it left a power vacuum. When the old empires crumble, new things grow in the cracks. The chaos of this period eventually led to the rise of the Sui and Tang dynasties, the golden age of China. But that was far in the future. For the people living in the 540s, there was no golden age. There was only the gray sky, the yellow dust, and the empty bowl. So we have seen the lights go out in Europe. We have seen the hunger in China. We have seen the plague in Constantinople. But remember, this was a global event. While the old world was falling apart, what was happening in the new world? What was happening in the jungles of Mexico and the mountains of Peru? Did they escape the wrath of the invisible volcano? Spoiler, no. No, they did not. In the next chapter, we are going to cross the ocean. We are going to visit the great city of Teotihuacan, the city of the gods. And we're going to find out why the people there decided that their gods had abandoned them, and why they decided to burn their own city to the ground. The darkness didn't need a passport. It traveled everywhere. Join me in Chapter 8, The Fall of Teotihuacan. We have spent the last few chapters watching the old world fall apart. We saw the Romans shivering in their togas, the Chinese farmers staring at the dust, and the rats taking over Constantinople. But the dark winter didn't stop at the Atlantic Ocean. It's easy to forget that while Justinian was building churches in Europe, there were massive, thriving civilizations happening right now in the Americas. They didn't know about Rome. They didn't know about the volcano in Iceland. But they definitely felt the consequences. So pack your bags. We are crossing the ocean. We are heading to the jungles of Mexico. Welcome to Chapter 8, The Fall of Teotihuacan. If you went to Mexico in the year 530 AD, just a few years before the darkness hit, you would have found one of the most incredible cities on Earth. Teotihuacan. The name actually means the place where men become gods. That's a pretty confident name for a city, right? But honestly, they could back it up. This place was huge. We are talking about a metropolis with over 100,000 people. It had paved streets, complex drainage systems, and massive, colorful murals painted on the walls. And dominating the skyline were the pyramids. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. These things were mountains made of stone. They were painted red and decorated with limestone. They were designed to impress you, to make you feel small, to make you believe that the people running the city had a direct phone line to the gods. The society of Teotihuacan was very organized. It was a strict hierarchy. At the top, you had the elites, the priests, and the rulers. They lived in fancy palaces along the main road, which is ominously called the Street of the Dead. They didn't call it that, the Aztecs named it that much later, but it fits the vibe. At the bottom, you had the common people living in apartment compounds. Now here is how the social contract worked. It was a deal. The common people said, okay, we will work hard. We will build your pyramids. We will give you our corn. We will obey your laws. And in exchange, the elite said, cool. We will talk to the gods. We will perform the rituals. And we will guarantee that the rain comes and the crops grow. It was a protection racket, basically. Nice farm you have there. Would be a shame if it stopped raining. For centuries, the deal worked. The rains came. The corn grew. The city got rich. But then came the year 536. The volcanic cloud that froze Europe and dried out China messed up the weather patterns in Mesoamerica too. The atmosphere is all connected. When you cool the northern hemisphere, you shift the jet streams. For Teotihuacan, this meant one thing: drought. The rains that usually arrived like clockwork in the summer just didn't show up. Now, corn or maize is a thirsty plant. It needs water at specific times. If you miss that window, the corn dies. And in Mesoamerica, corn corn wasn't just a vegetable. It was life. It was the main source of calories for everyone. The first year of the drought, the people probably got nervous. They looked at the dry sky. They looked at the dusty fields. And then they looked at the pyramids. They probably thought, "Hey, Mr. Priest, you might want to pray a little harder up there. The rain is late." The elites probably ramped up the rituals. They burned more incense. They sacrificed more precious items. They promised the people that the rain was coming. But the rain didn't come. Then the second year hit. The food reserves started running out. The water reservoirs in the city started to turn into muddy puddles. And this is where the chill tone of our story takes a sharp turn into something much more violent. Hunger does something to people. It strips away the fear of authority. When your children are crying because they haven't eaten in 3 days, you stop caring about how scary the priest looks in his feather headdress. You stop believing that the elites have special powers. The people of Teotihuacan started to realize that the deal was broken. We gave you the food. We built the temples. You promised rain. Where is the rain? If the elites couldn't control the weather, then why were they in charge? Why were they living in palaces while the rest of the city starved? The archaeological record gives us a chilling snapshot of what happened next. Usually, when a city is destroyed in ancient history, it's because of an invasion. An enemy army comes in, smashes everything, and burns the whole place down. But at Teotihuacan, the damage is very specific. Archaeologists found evidence of a massive fire that happened right around the mid-6th century. But here is the catch: the fire wasn't everywhere. The poor neighborhoods, the apartment compounds where the workers lived, they were mostly untouched. They were fine. But the palaces, the temples, the fancy administrative buildings along the Street of the Dead, they were torched. They were smashed, burned, and desecrated. The statues of the gods were toppled over. The staircases were ruined. This wasn't an invasion. This was a riot. This was a revolution. It was the ancient version of Eat the Rich. Imagine this scene. It's night. The city is hot, dry, and silent. The moon is obscured by the atmospheric dust. And suddenly, you see torches moving in the darkness. Thousands of angry, starving people marching down the Street of the Dead. They aren't carrying offerings this time. They are carrying rocks and fire. They storm the palaces. The guards are overwhelmed. The priests, who had spent their lives claiming to be gods, suddenly realize they are very, very mortal. The fire consumes the symbols of power. The smoke rises up to mix with the dust in the atmosphere. The biggest city in the New World is tearing itself apart from the inside. It must have been terrifying, but also, in a dark way, inevitable. You can't rule a people based on a promise of prosperity and then deliver starvation. After the fires, Teotihuacan didn't disappear overnight, but it was broken. The population started to leave. They walked away from the Great Pyramids. They abandoned the apartment compounds. They moved out into the smaller villages, trying to find food, trying to find a place where the gods weren't so angry. The jungle began to creep back in. Vines started to crawl up the steps of the Pyramid of the Sun. Grass grew in the cracks of the paved streets. The silence fell over the city. For centuries afterward, the Aztecs would find these massive ruins and be terrified of them. They didn't know who built them. They just saw the sheer size of the place and assumed giants must have lived there. They named it Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, because they couldn't imagine humans building something so big and then just leaving. But we know why they left. They left because the sky turned against them. The fall of Teotihuacan is a perfect example of how fragile civilization really is. It looks strong. It looks like it will last forever. But it's built on a foundation of stability. If you kick out the foundation, if you take away the rain, the whole thing comes crashing down. So the north was freezing. The east was starving. And now the great city of Central America was burning. But we aren't done with the Americas yet. We have to go further south. We have to go to the coast of Peru, to a civilization that loved blood, gold, and the ocean. They were the Moche. And while Teotihuacan was dealing with drought, the Moche were about to get hit with the climatic equivalent of a 1-2 punch. First the drought, then the flood, and then the bloodiest desperation you can imagine. Join me in Chapter 9, The Moche Sacrifice. We have watched the lights go out in Europe. We have seen the hunger destroy dynasties in China, and we just saw the people of Mexico burn their own city to the ground. But for our next stop, we are heading south, way south, to the dry, dusty coast of Peru. Welcome to Chapter 9, The Mosh Sacrifice. Now, if you were hanging out in Peru around the year 500 AD, you would have met the Mosh. And honestly, these guys were intense. They weren't an empire like the Romans, with one big boss in charge. They were more like a collection of city-states, kind of like ancient Greece, but with way more gold and way more blood. They were master artists. If you go to a museum today, the Mosh pottery is the stuff that makes you stop and stare. They made jars shaped like animals, warriors, and, well, let's just say they made some very adult pottery too. They captured every part of daily life. But they were also master engineers. They lived in a desert strip between the Andes Mountains and the Pacific Ocean. It almost never rains there. So, to grow food, they built massive irrigation canals to bring water down from the mountains. They turned the desert green. They built huge pyramids called huacas out of millions of mud bricks. The Huaca de la Luna, the Temple of the Moon, was beautifully decorated with colorful murals of gods and monsters. Everything was going great. They had corn, they had fish, and they had gold. But remember the rule of this video. In 536 AD, the rules of nature stopped working. When the volcano erupted in the north, it didn't just cool the air. It messed with the ocean currents. Specifically, it seems to have triggered a super El Niño event. Now, usually El Niño is a weather pattern that brings warm water and rain to South America. But this wasn't a normal El Niño. This was climate chaos. First, the Mosh got hit with a drought. A mega drought. Imagine you are a Mosh farmer. You wake up every day and check the canal. The water level is lower. The next day, it's lower again. Eventually, the water stops coming from the mountains entirely. The wind starts to blow. And since you live in a desert, the wind brings sand. Great dunes of sand started marching across the fields. They filled up the canals that took centuries to build. The green strips of farmland were swallowed by the beige desert. The corn dried up and turned to dust. But then, just when they thought it couldn't get worse, the pendulum swung the other way. The drought ended, and the floods began. And I don't mean a nice, gentle shower. I mean biblical torrents of rain. Now, remember those pyramids I mentioned? The huacas? They were made of mud bricks. Mud bricks are great in a dry desert. They are cheap, strong, and easy to make. But do you know what happens to a mud brick when you pour a tropical storm on it? It melts. Imagine the horror of the Mosh priests. They are standing on top of their sacred pyramid, the house of their gods. And literally, the temple is dissolving under their feet. The beautiful murals of the decapitator god are running down the walls in streaks of red and yellow paint. The city is turning into a soup of mud. Houses are washing away. The few crops that survived the drought are now drowning in floodwater. It was a complete disaster. And this is where we get to the dark part. The part that gives this chapter its name. The Mosh were a deeply religious people. They believed that the weather wasn't just random. It was a conversation. If the sun was shining, the gods were happy. If the river was dry, the gods were thirsty. And if the world is ending, if the desert is eating your fields and the rain is melting your temples, then the gods must be furious. And the only way to calm down a furious god is with a gift. Big gift. The Mosh had a tradition of ritual sacrifice. We have found the artwork. It shows warrior priests drinking the blood of captives. It was brutal, but usually it was done on a small scale. It was a symbolic thing to keep the universe balanced. But in the mid-6th century, the balance was gone. Archaeologists have excavated the plazas near the Temple of the Moon, and what they found there tells a tragic story of desperation. They found bodies. Lots of bodies. These weren't people who died of old age. These were young men, warriors, strong and healthy. They had been captured, brought to the mud-slick plaza of the melting pyramid, and executed. But the details are what make it truly sad. The bodies were found encased in layers of mud. Deep, thick mud. This tells us that they were sacrificed during the torrential rains. You can almost see this scene. It's pouring rain. The sky is dark. The priests are frantic. They are dragging these young men out into the storm. They are shouting prayers to the roaring thunder, begging the gods to stop the water. Slit. One sacrifice. Does the rain stop? No. It falls harder. Slit. Another sacrifice. Still the rain falls. They kept doing it. They piled the bodies up in the mud, hoping that if they just gave enough blood, the sun would come back. It was a panic. It was a spiritual emergency. The elites were terrified that they were losing control. They were throwing everything they had at the problem, paying the ultimate price to save their civilization. But the sky didn't care about their blood. The invisible volcano thousands of miles away didn't care about their prayers. The rain kept falling until the cycle ended on its own. And by then, the Mosh society was broken. The people looked at the melted pyramids. They looked at the sand-choked canals. And they looked at the priests who had promised to protect them. They realized that the priests were powerless. The gods had stopped listening. We see evidence that the Mosh people actually turned on their leaders. They abandoned the great temples. They stopped maintaining the big cities. They moved inland into the valleys, building smaller, fortified towns. They went from a glorious, open civilization to a scared, defensive one. The great Mosh culture didn't vanish overnight, but it never recovered its golden age. The dark winter broke their spirit. It proved that their religion couldn't stop the climate. It is a haunting thought. Imagine believing so strongly that you could fix the weather, sacrificing your own children and warriors, only to watch the rain keep falling on their bodies. The silence that fell over the Peruvian coast wasn't the silence of snow, like in Europe. It was the silence of the sand reclaiming the ruins. The wind blew over the melted stumps of the pyramids, burying the secrets of the Mosh under the dunes. So we have seen the heat of the tropics turn into a disaster zone. But for the next chapter, we are going to go to the place where the dark winter was most literal. We are going to the frozen north, to Scandinavia. In the lands of the Vikings, well, the ancestors of the Vikings, the sun didn't just dim. It vanished. The winter lasted for 3 years. And the people there didn't just write history books about it. They turned it into a myth that we still tell today. They didn't call it the Dust Veil event. They called it Fimbulwinter, the winter that ends the world. Grab your fur coats and your axes. We are heading to the land of the midnight sun, where the sun forgot to wake up. Join me in Chapter 10, Fimbulwinter, the real Ragnarok. We have traveled all over the world. We've been to the deserts of Peru, the jungles of Mexico, and the cities of Rome. But now we are going to the place where winter isn't just a season. It's a lifestyle. Welcome to Chapter 10, Fimbulwinter, the real Ragnarok. If you're a fan of Norse mythology, Thor, Odin, Loki, the Marvel movies, you probably know about Ragnarok. It is the Viking version of the apocalypse, the end of the world, the big battle where the gods die and the earth burns. But before the fire, the myths say there comes the ice. The legends tell of a time called Fimbulwinter, the mighty winter, the great winter. The story goes like this: snow will drive in from all directions. The frost will not break. The sun will not shine. And there will be 3 winters in a row, with no summer in between. For a long time, historians thought this was just a cool story. Just a spooky campfire tale to scare the kids. Eat your porridge, or the wolf will eat the sun. But then we looked at the science of 536 AD. And we realized something that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Fimbulwinter wasn't a myth. It was a memory. Let's go to Scandinavia, modern-day Sweden, Norway, and Denmark in the year 536. Even in a good year, life up here was tough. You had a short summer to grow your barley and hay, and then a long, dark winter where you tried not to freeze. It was a life on the edge. But in 536, the edge crumbled. When that volcanic veil covered the sky, the effect in the far north was devastating. In the Mediterranean, the sun was dim. But up here, because of the angle of the earth, the sun basically vanished. The summer of 536 didn't happen. The snow melted a little bit, maybe turned to slush, and then froze again. The hay didn't grow. And if the hay doesn't grow, the cows don't eat. And if the cows don't eat, they die. And if the cows die, you die. Archaeologists have spent years digging around in Sweden and Norway, and what they found is practically a crime scene on a national scale. They found abandoned farms, thousands of them. In some regions of Sweden, 50% of the farms were abandoned in the middle of the 6th century. Just empty. Gone. The forest grew back over the fields. Imagine walking through the woods and finding a ghost town. The roof of the longhouse has collapsed. The tools are rusting in the dirt. The cooking pot is still sitting by the fire pit. Where did the people go? They didn't move to Florida. They died. Or they packed up and desperately tried to find food somewhere else, probably fighting their neighbors for it. The Norse myths actually describe this part too. The poem says that during Fimbulwinter, brothers shall fight and fell each other. It is a sword age, a wind age, a wolf age before the world falls. It wasn't just the cold, it was the violence. When the food runs out, the laws of society break down. It becomes survival of the fittest. Now let's talk about the sun wolf. In the mythology, there is a giant wolf named Skoll. His job is to chase the sun across the sky. At the end of the world, he finally catches it and swallows it whole. Imagine you are a Viking ancestor standing in a snowy field in 536. You look up. The sun is supposed to be bright and yellow, but instead, it is a weird, reddish, weak blob behind a wall of gray fog. It looks like it's being digested. It's easy to see how they came up with the story, isn't it? They looked at the sky and thought, well, that's it. The wolf won. The sun is dead. The psychological impact of this must have been profound. These people lived in the longhouse. It's a big wooden hall where the whole family, and usually the animals, live together to stay warm. Picture the scene inside a longhouse during the dark winter. It's dark, obviously. You have a fire going in the center, but you are running low on wood. The smoke is stinging your eyes. The smell is, well, you have cows and sheep living in the room with you, so it smells like a barn. But the animals are getting skinny. They are quiet. The children are crying because they are hungry. And outside, the wind is howling. It's been howling for months. You keep waiting for spring, but spring is 3 months late. The snow is piled up to the roof. You start to tell stories to pass the time. You tell stories about why this is happening. You tell stories about monsters and gods. And in the flickering light of that dying fire, the legend of Ragnarok is born. But the people of Scandinavia didn't just tell stories. They tried to fix it. And this leads us to the most shiny, tragic evidence of the event, the gold hoards. All over Scandinavia, people have found treasures buried in the ground from this exact time period. Beautiful gold necklaces, heavy gold rings, and special medallions called bracteates. Now, usually you bury treasure to keep it safe, right? You bury it so you can come back and get it later. But these hoards were different. They were buried in swamps. They were buried in lakes. They were buried in places where you couldn't get them back. Why? Because they weren't savings accounts. They were bribes. The people were desperate. They thought the gods had abandoned them. Odin, Thor, Freyr, they weren't answering the phone. So the wealthy chieftains took their most precious things, their status, their wealth, their gold, and they gave it back to the earth. They were saying, here, take it. Take all the gold. Just please, give us the sun back. Some of these bracteates actually have images on them that look like the sun, or horses or gods. They were desperate pleas for warmth. It is heartbreaking when you think about it. Imagine a powerful chieftain, a guy who has spent his whole life fighting for gold, walking out into a freezing swamp and throwing it all away, just hoping his kids won't starve to death. But the gold didn't work. The sun stayed dim. This trauma changed the society forever. Before 536, the society in Scandinavia was mostly based on farming. It was relatively peaceful. For the ancient world. But after the dust cleared, the society that emerged was harder. It was meaner. It was more militarized. The survivors were the ones who were willing to fight for the last scrap of bread. They were the ones who could endure the cold. This disaster effectively killed the old way of life and gave birth to the Viking Age. The Vikings didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were forged in the ice of Fimbulwinter. The memory of that starvation taught them a lesson. The world is cruel, resources are scarce, and if you want to survive, you have to take what you need. The ships that would eventually sail out to terrorize England and France were built by the descendants of the people who survived the Long Night. The myth of Ragnarok ends with the world being reborn. And in a way, that is what happened. The old world died in the snow, and a new, fiercer world was born. But there is one specific type of treasure they buried that is so interesting, it deserves its own spotlight. It tells us exactly what they were thinking. It tells us about the gold of the gods. We talked about the bribes, but we need to look closer at what they buried. Because it wasn't just money, it was magic. In the next chapter, we are going to dig up the mud of Denmark and Sweden. We are going to look at these golden amulets and see the face of the god they were praying to. And we're going to see how the fear of the dark turned into a lust for gold that would drive the Vikings to the ends of the earth. Join me in Chapter 11, The Gold of the Gods. We have spent the last chapter shivering in the Scandinavian snow, watching the real-life version of Game of Thrones play out. We saw the farms empty out and the forests grow back over the fields. But now we need to zoom in on something specific. Something shiny. Welcome to Chapter 11, The Gold of the Gods. If you go to a museum in Denmark or Sweden today, you will see glass cases filled with incredible gold objects from the 6th century. Massive neck rings, heavy armbands, and most importantly, these thin golden discs called bracteates. They look like big coins, but they weren't money. You couldn't buy cow with them. They were jewelry, amulets, and magic charms all rolled into one. And during the years of the Dust Veil, people started burying them like crazy. Now, usually, when you find buried treasure, it's a hoard. The story is usually, oh no, the enemies are coming. Quick, bury the family's savings under the oak tree, and we will come back for it when the coast is clear. But archaeologists noticed something weird about the hoards from the mid-500s. They weren't buried under the floorboards. They weren't buried in a marked spot. They were thrown into bogs. They were tossed into lakes. They were buried deep in the mud in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't a savings account. This was a sacrifice. Imagine you are a wealthy chieftain in Denmark in the year 540 AD. You are the big man on campus. You have the biggest longhouse, the most cows, and the most gold. Your power comes from two things: your ability to feed your people and your connection to the gods. But for 3 years you have failed. The sun is gone. The cows are dead. The people are starving. They are looking at you with hollow eyes, and they are whispering that you have lost your luck, that the gods hate you. So you have to do something big. You have to make a grand gesture. You take your gold, and not just a little bit. We are talking about kilograms of the stuff. Gold that represents your entire family's wealth. Gold that your grandfather stole from the Romans. You march out into the freezing cold. You walk to the edge of the sacred swamp, because the Vikings believed swamps were doorways to the spirit world. It's quiet. The only sound is the wind in the dead trees and the crunch of frost under your boots. Then you throw it in. Splash. You watch your fortune sink into the black, freezing mud. You watch the bubbles rise. And you pray. Odin, Freyr, I have given you everything. Give us back the sun. It's a desperate, tragic act. It's the ancient equivalent of burning a pile of money, hoping it will fix the economy. But let's look closer at these bracteates, because the pictures on them are fascinating. A lot of them show a large head, probably a god, maybe Odin, and a horse. Sometimes the horse looks hurt. Sometimes there are birds. Scholars think these were healing amulets. They were magical prayers stamped into gold. They were asking the gods to heal the world, to fix the broken leg of the universe. And the fact that they are made of gold is important. Gold is the color of the sun. It never tarnishes. It never fades. It shines even in the dark. By burying the sun metal in the earth, maybe they were trying to jumpstart the real sun in the sky, like using jumper cables on a dead battery. But here is the dark twist. We find so much gold from this period because it didn't work. The sun didn't come back immediately. The crops didn't grow. The chieftain who threw his gold in the swamp probably died of starvation the next winter, or got killed by a rival who was smart enough to keep his sword instead of throwing it away. He never came back to dig it up because he couldn't. This massive burying of wealth marks a huge shift in Scandinavian society. It marks the death of the farmer society and the birth of the warrior society. Before the darkness, power was about land and harvest. After the darkness, power was about strength and seizing resources. Think about it. If you are a survivor of the Fimbulwinter, you have learned a hard lesson. You learned that nature is trying to kill you. You learn that the gods demand high prices. And you learn that having gold buried in a swamp is useless when you need food. The society that crawled out of the snow was harder. The art style changed. It became more twisted, with gripping beasts and tangled snakes, the animal style that we associate with Vikings. It reflects a world that is chaotic and dangerous. And the distribution of wealth changed too. The old families who relied on farming died out. The new leaders were the ones who could command warbands. The ones who said, "Forget the swamp. We are going to take that guy's cows." This was the crucible that forged the Vikings. The trauma of 536 created a culture that was obsessed with fate. The Vikings believed that your death was written the day you were born. You couldn't change it. Why worry? Why be careful? If the wolf is going to eat the sun anyway, you might as well go out fighting. That fatalism, that we are all going to die, so let's make it glorious attitude, comes straight from the memory of the time when the world actually did end. It's amazing to think that those glittering pieces of gold sitting in a quiet museum in Copenhagen are actually monuments to panic. They aren't just jewelry. They are screams for help frozen in metal. And while the Scandinavians were burying their gold, something else was happening further south and east. The survivors of the catastrophe were starting to move. The old empires were too weak to stop them. The borders were open. The darkness had cleared the board. The pieces were reset. And now a new force was gathering on the steppe. A force of horse archers who saw the weakness of Europe and decided it was free real estate. The Avars were coming. And they weren't bringing gold to throw in a swamp. They were coming to take it. In the next chapter, we are going to watch the domino effect of migration. How the cold grass of Asia pushed a wave of warriors right into the face of the Roman Empire, and how the map of the world was redrawn by hunger. Join me in Chapter 12, The Rise of the Steppe. We have dug up the gold in the swamps of Scandinavia. We have watched the Vikings get their start in the freezing north. But while the Norsemen were burying their treasure, something massive was happening to the east. If you look at a map of the world, there is a giant strip of land that runs all the way from Hungary to China. It's flat, it's wide, and it's covered in grass. Historians call it the Eurasian steppe. I like to call it the superhighway of the ancient world. Welcome to Chapter 12, The Rise of the Steppe. For thousands of years, this highway was busy. Nomadic tribes lived there, herding their sheep, riding their horses, and occasionally terrifying the settled people who lived in cities. Life on the steppe is simple. It revolves around one thing: grass. Grass feeds the horses. Horses provide milk, meat, and transportation. If you have grass, you have life. But in 536 AD, the grass turned brown. When the volcanic winter hit, it didn't just freeze the wheat in Rome or the rice in China. It froze the steppe. The rain stopped. The temperature plummeted. The lush green ocean of grass turned into a brittle, dry wasteland. Now, if you are a farmer and your crop fails, you starve in your house. But if you are a nomad and the grass dies, you move. You pack up your tents, your yurts. You round up your skinny, shivering horses, and you start walking. You look for greener pastures. But here is the problem. The pastures aren't empty. There is another tribe living 10 miles down the road. And they are hungry too. So you have two choices. You fight them for their grass, or you push them out of the way. This triggered a massive, violent game of musical chairs. It started in the Far East, near Mongolia. The sudden cold snap destabilized the big empires there, like the Rurin Khaganate. The chaos birthed a new power, the Gokturks, the Turks. These guys were tough, organized, and expanding fast. They started pushing westward. They pushed a group called the Avars. The Avars are the stars of this chapter. You might not have heard of them as much as the Huns or the Mongols, but in the 6th century, they were the nightmare of Europe. Imagine the Avars. They are running away from the Turks, so they are desperate. They are moving west along the steppe highway, and they are moving fast. As they move, they crash into other tribes, the Bulgars, the Slavs, the Huns who were left over from Attila's day. The Avars basically said, move or die. So, those tribes started running west too. It was a domino effect. One tribe pushes the next, who pushes the next, until eventually someone gets pushed right into the backyard of the Roman Empire. By the year 558, the Avars arrived at the Danube River. This was the border of the Byzantine Empire. Imagine being a Roman border guard. You were tired. You survived the darkness of 536. You survived the plague of 542. You haven't been paid in months because the emperor is broke. And suddenly, you look across the river and you see dust. Miles and miles of dust. And out of the dust comes an endless caravan of horses, wagons, women, children, and warriors. These weren't just raiders looking to steal a few cows. This was a nation on the move. They weren't visiting. They were moving in. The Avars sent an ambassador to Constantinople to meet Emperor Justinian. At this point, Justinian was an old man. He had seen it all. The Avar ambassador walked into the throne room. He was probably wearing silk robes, his hair braided in long plaits down his back, which was the Avar style. And he basically said, we are the Avars. We are the greatest warriors in the world. If you pay us lots of gold, we won't destroy you. In fact, we will beat up your other enemies for you. Justinian, being a pragmatic guy and terrified, said, okay, here is the gold. He hoped that paying them would make them go away, or maybe settle down quietly. He was wrong. The Avars took the gold, bought better weapons, and then proceeded to conquer almost everything in Eastern Europe. They created a massive empire centered in Hungary. But the arrival of the Avars didn't just change the map, it changed how humans fought wars. Because the Avars brought a piece of technology with them that was more important than any sword or bow. It was a little metal loop that hung from the saddle. The stirrup. Now, this is a bit controversial among historians. Some say the Avars brought it, some say it was coming anyway, but the timing matches up perfectly. Before this, riders had to grip the horse with their thighs. It was hard to stay on if you got hit. But with stirrups, you were locked in. You can stand up in the saddle. You can shoot an arrow with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. And most importantly, you can charge with a lance. Without stirrups, if you hit someone with a heavy spear while riding a horse, the impact would knock you off the back of the horse. Physics, right? But with stirrups, you can brace yourself. You become a solid missile. The force of the horse, the rider, and the spear all focus on one tip. It was the ancient equivalent of a tank shell. The Roman infantry, standing on the ground with their shields, didn't stand a chance. The dark winter had weakened the Roman army. The plague had killed their soldiers. And now, this new high-tech cavalry from the steppe was running circles around them. This changed the face of warfare for the next 1,000 years. The age of the Roman legionnaire, the guy walking on foot with a sword, was ending. The age of the knight, the armored guy on a horse, was beginning. And it wasn't just the soldiers. The migration of the steppe tribes pushed other people around too. Specifically, the Slavs. The Slavic people used to live in the forests of Eastern Europe, minding their own business. But the Avar steamroller forced them to move. They migrated south, crossing the Danube, and settling in the Balkans. If you look at a map of Europe today, countries like Serbia, Croatia, and Bulgaria exist where they do partly because of this massive shuffle in the 6th century. It's crazy to think about the chain reaction. A volcano in Iceland explodes. The grass in Mongolia dies. The Turks push the Avars. The Avars push the Slavs. And the Roman Empire gets smashed in the face. Justinian spent his whole life trying to restore the old Roman Empire. He wanted to bring back the glory days of Augustus. But he was fighting against the tide of history. The world was changing too fast. The climate, the disease, and the migrations were rewriting the rules. By the time the Avars were settled in Hungary, the connection between East and West was broken. The roads were unsafe. Trade slowed down. The global economy of the ancient world was being replaced by a bunch of local warlords sitting in castles, afraid to go outside. The steppe had come to Europe, and it had brought the Middle Ages with it. But there is one final piece to this puzzle. We have talked about the chaos. We have talked about the collapse. But eventually, the dust has to settle. The ice has to melt. And when it did, the people who were left standing looked around and realized that the old world, the world of togas and temples, was gone. They had to build something new. In the next chapter, we are going to look at the wreckage of the Roman economy. We are going to see how the dark winter broke the complex trade networks of antiquity and forced everyone to go local. We are going to witness the birth of the Middle Ages. Join me in Chapter 13. We have watched the world freeze, starve, get sick, and get invaded by guys with fancy stirrups. It's been a rough century, but now we need to step back and look at the biggest change of all. You know how historians divide history into chunks? You have ancient history, togas, pyramids, gladiators, and then you have the Middle Ages, knights, castles, dragons. For a long time, people argued about when exactly the first one ended and the second one began. Did it happen when Rome fell in 476? Did it happen when Islam rose in the 600s? Well, more and more historians are pointing at the year 536 and saying, that's it. That's the moment the lights went out. Welcome to Chapter 13, the birth of the Middle Ages. To understand why this is such a big deal, we have to talk about shopping. Seriously, if you lived in the Roman Empire before the Dark Winter, let's say in the year 500, you were part of a massive global economy. Let's say you lived in London. You could walk into a market and buy olive oil from Spain. You could buy wine from Italy. You could buy a nice ceramic bowl made in North Africa. You could buy silk that came all the way from China. It was like Amazon Prime, but with ox carts and ships. The Roman world was interconnected. It relied on complex systems. You needed safe roads, which meant you needed a strong army to patrol them. You needed safe seas, which meant you needed a navy to hunt pirates. And you needed a stable currency that everyone trusted. But the events of 536 took a sledgehammer to this entire delicate machine. First, the people died. We talked about the plague killing maybe half the population. That means half the customers are gone. Half the sailors are gone. Half the guys who fixed the roads are gone. Then the safety vanished. The Avars and other tribes were raiding the borders. The roads became dangerous. If you were a merchant, you were going to risk your life to haul a wagon of pottery from Tunisia to France. It wasn't worth it. So the trade stopped. Archaeologists can actually see this happen in the ground. In the layers of dirt from the early 500s, you find pottery from all over the world. But in the layers from the late 500s, it stops. Suddenly, the pottery is local. It's rougher. It's homemade. If you lived in London in 560, you weren't buying Spanish oil anymore. You were using whatever fat you could render from your own pig. You weren't drinking Italian wine. You were drinking local beer. If you were lucky, the world shrank. For 1,000 years, the horizon was the empire. Now the horizon was the village. This is the birth of the medieval mindset. The Dark Winter forced people to stop looking outward and start looking inward. And this leads us to the cities. The Roman world was a world of cities. Carthage, Antioch, Rome, Constantinople. These were places with libraries, public baths, theaters, and schools. But cities are expensive. They need huge amounts of food brought in every day. They need clean water. When the aqueducts broke, the cities died. This is one of the most haunting images of this era. Imagine a massive Roman aqueduct, those giant stone bridges that carried water for miles. In the glory days, they were maintained by teams of engineers. But after the plague and the economic collapse, there was no money to pay the engineers. There was no one to fix the cracks. So one day the water stopped flowing. The public baths ran dry. The fountains stopped working. The sewers clogged up. You can't live in a city of 1 million people without running water. It becomes a disease trap. So the people left. Rome, which once had a population of over 1 million, shrank to maybe 30,000 people. Imagine that. A city built for giants, inhabited by a few survivors huddled in the ruins. People started planting vegetable gardens in the middle of the forum. They turned the great theaters into fortresses. They grazed their cows in the abandoned palaces. It was a post-apocalyptic wasteland, centuries before Hollywood invented the genre. But people still need safety. In fact, they need it more than ever because the world is scary and full of bandits. Since the emperor in Constantinople couldn't protect them anymore, he was too far away, too broke, and too busy fighting wars. People had to look for protection closer to home. Enter the local warlord. This is how feudalism starts. It wasn't a system someone invented on paper. It was a survival strategy. Imagine you are a peasant. You are scared. You have a little bit of food, but you can't defend it. Down the road, there is a big guy with a sword and a horse. He has a few friends who also have swords. You go to him and say, "Hey, if I give you half my food, will you make sure the bandits don't kill me?" And the big guy says, "Deal." That's it. That is the feudal contract. You give up your freedom and your surplus food in exchange for staying alive. The big guy eventually becomes a lord. His house becomes a castle, and you become a serf. The centralized state, where everyone follows the same laws and pays taxes to the same capital, was gone. In its place was a patchwork quilt of thousands of little territories. Every hill had a boss. Every bridge had a toll. It was a step backward in terms of technology and comfort. You didn't have heated floors anymore. You didn't have literature. You didn't have concrete. Yes, they actually forgot how to make concrete, but it was a step forward in terms of survival. It was a system built for a broken world. The Dark Winter had taught humanity a hard lesson. Complexity is fragile. The Roman Empire was complex, efficient, and beautiful, but one bad decade of volcanoes and germs knocked it over. The feudal system was ugly, brutal, and simple, but it was sturdy. It could survive the cold. And we can't forget the psychological shift. In antiquity, the focus was often on the human. Roman art was realistic. Greek philosophy was about logic and nature. But after 536, the focus shifted entirely to the divine. If the physical world is freezing, starving, and dying, why would you care about it? The only thing that mattered was the next world. Heaven. The art became abstract and spiritual. The literature became almost entirely religious. The church became the only institution that held things together. When the Roman government collapsed, the local bishops were often the only ones left who knew how to read, write, and organize things. They took over the job of running the cities. So you have this total transformation. Economy, from global to local. Politics, from emperor to warlord. Lifestyle, from city to farm. Vibe, from let's build a great society to please God, just let me survive the winter. It sounds depressing. And honestly, it was. The Dark Ages is a term historians try not to use anymore because it sounds judgmental. They prefer early Middle Ages. But if you were standing in the ruins of a Roman villa in the year 600, watching your goats eat grass growing out of a mosaic floor, it probably felt pretty dark. The sun had come back to the sky, yes. The physical darkness of 536 was gone. But the light of civilization, literacy, engineering, trade, law had dimmed significantly. It would take Europe almost 1,000 years to get back to the level of complexity they had before the volcano blew its top. But here is the twist. We know all of this now. We can look back and see the connections. We can trace the pottery and the pollen and the plague DNA. But for centuries, the cause of this collapse was a mystery. The people of the Middle Ages didn't know about the volcano. They just knew the world had changed. It wasn't until very recently, like in our lifetimes, that scientists finally cracked the code. They found the fingerprint of the killer frozen in the ice. In the next chapter, we are going to jump forward in time. We are going to put on our lab coats and visit the scientists who solved the cold case of the 6th century. We are going to see how a team of researchers drilling into a glacier found the exact moment the world ended. Join me in Chapter 14, Unlocking the Ice. We have spent the last 13 chapters living in the past. We walked through the dark streets of Constantinople, we shivered in the Swedish snow, and we watched civilizations crumble. But the people living through that nightmare had a big problem. They didn't know why it was happening. To them, it was magic. It was God. It was a dragon eating the sun. They didn't have the tools to understand the atmosphere. But we do. So for this chapter, we are going to take off our togas and put on our lab coats. We are leaving the dusty libraries, heading to the frozen corners of the earth. Welcome to Chapter 14, Unlocking the Ice. This is the part of the story where it turns into a detective show. Imagine a cold case episode, but the body has been missing for 1,500 years. For a long time, modern historians read the old texts, like Procopius saying the sun looked like the moon, and they were skeptical. They thought, okay, these ancient guys are being dramatic. They love a good metaphor. The sun probably just looked a little dim for a week. You can't blame them. Ancient writers did exaggerate a lot. But in the late 20th century, a different kind of historian entered the chat. These guys didn't read books. They read nature. The The first clue didn't come from a volcano. It came from a swamp in Ireland. Meet the paleoecologist, specifically a guy named Mike Bailey. He was studying ancient oak trees that had been preserved in the Irish bogs. These trees are incredible. The bog water keeps them from rotting, so you can pull up a piece of wood that is thousands of years old, and it looks like it fell yesterday. Now, trees are nature's hard drives. Every year, they grow a new ring. If the weather is warm and wet, the tree is happy, and it grows a nice, fat ring. If the weather is freezing and dry, the tree is miserable, and the ring is tiny. Bailey started looking at the rings from the 6th century. He was counting back. 600, 580, 550, and then he hit 536. The ring for that year was practically invisible. It was microscopic. And it wasn't just 536. The rings for the next decade were tight, cramped, and miserable. The trees were screaming, "We are freezing to death." Bailey realized this wasn't just a bad summer. This was a biological collapse. He compared his Irish oaks to tree rings from Germany, Scandinavia, and even Siberia. They all said the same thing. In 536, growth stopped. So now we had a witness. The trees confirmed that the Roman writers weren't lying. The world really did freeze. But trees can only tell you that it was cold. They can't tell you why. Was it a meteor? Was it the sun getting weaker? Was it a volcano? To find the weapon, we had to go to the greatest archive on the planet, the ice sheets. Let's fly to Greenland. It is a massive, white, frozen desert. But if you drill down, straight down, you are drilling through time. Snow falls every year. It traps dust, chemicals, and air bubbles. Then the next year's snow falls on top and squishes it into ice. This happens for thousands of years. So if you drill a long cylinder of ice called an ice core, you can pull it up and read it like a book. The deeper you go, the further back in time you are. In roughly 2018, a team led by researchers including Michael McCormick and Paul Mayuski decided to take a very close look at the ice from the 6th century. Now, previous scientists had looked at the ice, but technology had gotten a lot better. These guys used a laser. They melted the ice core, sliver by tiny sliver, and fed the water into a machine that could detect chemical elements down to the parts per quadrillion. That is an insanely small number. That is like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach the size of the moon. They moved the laser down the ice core. Year 540. Nothing special. Year 538. Some dust. And then they hit the layer for early 536. The machine spiked. It found sulfur. Huge amounts of sulfur. Now, we know from Chapter 2 that sulfur is what volcanoes shoot into the stratosphere. When that sulfur hits the ice, it stays there forever. This spike proved, without a doubt, that a massive volcanic event happened right at the start of the darkness. But the scientists didn't stop there. They wanted the smoking gun. They looked for tephra. Tephra is just a fancy word for volcanic glass. When a volcano explodes, it freezes magma into microscopic shards of glass. These shards are like fingerprints. Every volcano has a unique chemical recipe. The magma from Iceland looks different from the magma from Indonesia. The team filtered the water from the 536 ice layer. They looked under a high-powered microscope, and there it was. Tiny, jagged shards of orange glass. It was the aha moment of the century. They had found the physical remains of the cloud that killed the Roman Empire. They analyzed the chemical makeup of the glass. They compared it to volcanoes all over the world. And the match came back. It looked remarkably like the volcanic systems in Iceland or potentially parts of North America. This was huge. For years, people thought maybe the eruption was in the tropics, like Ilopango in El Salvador. And while Ilopango might have erupted around this time, maybe a few years later, the ice core showed that the first big blast, the one that started the nightmare in 536, came from the high north. This explained why the northern hemisphere got hit so hard. It explained the fog that didn't go away. But the ice had one more surprise for them. The scientists kept moving the laser up the core. They looked at the years after 536. They found another spike in 540, another massive eruption, and then another one in 547. It wasn't just one bad day. It was a volcanic cluster. The Earth basically had a temper tantrum that lasted for 11 years. Bang, bang, bang. 3 massive eruptions in just over a decade. No wonder humanity collapsed. We can handle one disaster. We can bounce back. But 3, back to back, that's not fair. And there was one final detail in the ice that connected everything perfectly. Lead. You see, the Romans used lead for everything. They used it to make silver coins, a process called smelting. When the Roman economy was booming, the air in Europe was actually full of lead pollution. It drifted up to Greenland and got stuck in the ice. So usually when you look at ice from the Roman period, you see high lead levels. It's the smell of money and industry. But the researchers looked at the lead levels right after 536. The line flatlined. The lead pollution vanished. This was the chemical proof of what we talked about in the last chapter. The economy stopped. The smelting fires went out. The coins stopped being made. The ice confirmed the economic collapse. It is almost poetic in a sad way. The ice trapped the evidence of the volcano that destroyed the world, and also trapped the silence of the factories that shut down because of it. Finding these clues was a triumph for science. It brought together historians, geologists, and chemists. It validated the stories of the people who suffered. When Procopius wrote about the dread and the dim sun, he wasn't making it up. He was a journalist reporting on a real climatic shift. When the Irish monks wrote about the failure of bread, they were reporting data. When the Chinese scribes wrote about yellow dust, they were accurate. We finally have the full picture. We know the weapon, the volcano. We know the timeline, 536 to 547. And we know the victim, everyone. This discovery forces us to respect the planet a little bit more. We tend to think that history is made by humans. We think history is about kings, queens, generals, and presidents. We think we are in charge. But the ice cores tell a different story. They tell us that the biggest turning points in history, the rise of the Middle Ages, the fall of empires, the migration of nations, can be triggered by a rock melting deep underground. We are just passengers on this rock. And sometimes the rock decides to change the itinerary. So we have solved the mystery. We have walked through the darkness. We have seen the horror and the science. But there is one question left. Did we make it? Obviously, yes. You are watching this video. I am writing this script. Humanity didn't go extinct. We are tough. We are stubborn. But how do we climb out of the hole? What did the world look like when the sun finally broke through the clouds? For our final chapter, we are going to look at the dawn. We are going to look at how the survivors picked up the pieces and built the modern world. It wasn't the end. It was just a very, very painful new beginning. Join me for the finale in Chapter 15, The Dawn After the Dark. This has been a long, cold, and scary journey. We started with a fog in 536. We watched the crops die. We watched the rats board the ships. We watched the gold sink into the swamps. For 14 chapters, we have talked about how the world ended. But here is the good news. The world didn't actually end. The sun came back. Welcome to the finale. Chapter 15, The Dawn After the Dark. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like a movie where the hero defeats the villain and suddenly the birds start singing and rainbows appear. The recovery from the dark winter was slow. It was painful. It took decades. But eventually, the volcanic dust settled out of the atmosphere. The stratosphere cleared up. The sun, which had been a pale ghost for so long, finally turned yellow and hot again. The rains in China stopped being yellow dust and started being actual water. Imagine the relief of the first generation of kids who grew up after the disaster. They saw a harvest that actually worked. They saw grapes that actually ripened. They saw a summer that actually felt like summer. It must have felt like a miracle. But the world they inherited was completely different from the world their grandparents lived in. The dark winter had acted like a giant reset button on human history. The board had been wiped clean. And now, new players were ready to start the next game. Let's look at the Middle East first. Remember the Roman and Persian empires? They had spent the last century fighting each other, starving, and getting hit by the plague. They were exhausted. They were like two heavyweight boxers in the 12th round, bruised, bleeding, and barely standing up. Their armies were depleted. Their treasuries were empty because of the economic collapse we talked about. And right in the middle of this exhaustion, a new voice spoke up from the desert. In the early 600s, just a few decades after the worst of the chaos, the religion of Islam was born in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, usually, big empires like Rome and Persia would have crushed a new movement like this instantly. But they couldn't. They were too weak. They were plague broke. The armies of the early Islamic caliphates moved into this power vacuum with incredible speed. They swept through the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain. The people in those lands were so tired of the corrupt, failing old empires that many of them just opened the gates. The Dark Winter had weakened the old guard so much that it allowed a brand new civilization to rise. And this new civilization, the Islamic Golden Age, would go on to preserve science, medicine, and mathematics while Europe was busy hitting people with clubs in the mud. It's a butterfly effect. A volcano explodes in Iceland dash, Rome gets weak dash, the map of the Middle East changes forever. Now let's look at China. We saw the yellow dust destroy the old dynasties. It was chaos for a while, but out of that chaos rose the Tang dynasty. Historians love the Tang dynasty. It is often called the greatest period in Chinese history. Why? Because after the starvation, the survivors figured out better ways to farm. They reorganized the government to be more efficient. They realized that relying on the old ways was a death sentence. The Tang dynasty wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving. This is the era of the Silk Road booming again. It's the era of beautiful poetry and art. The population bounced back. The rice paddies were green again. It proves that societies are resilient. You can knock them down, you can starve them, but you can't kill the human desire to build something better. China took the worst hit imaginable and turned it into a golden age. And finally, let's go back to Europe. Poor, freezing, plague-ridden Europe. They didn't have a golden age right away. They had the Middle Ages. But here is the thing, the Middle Ages weren't just about being backwards. They were about adaptation. The massive Roman slave plantations didn't work anymore. So Europe invented new technology. They invented the heavy plow to farm the thick, northern soil. They invented water mills to grind grain without needing slaves. They moved from a society that relied on big government to a society that relied on local community. The darkness forced them to be self-reliant. If the emperor isn't coming to save you, you save yourself. You build a wall around your town. You stockpile your own food. You forge your own tools. This grit, this survivalist attitude, is what eventually built the nations of modern Europe. France, England, Germany. The roots of these countries are found in the muddy survival struggles of the post-536 world. So, what is the lesson here? We have spent 15,000 words talking about doom. But I don't want to leave you feeling depressed. I want to leave you feeling impressed. Think about what those people survived. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have antibiotics. They didn't have canned food. They didn't even know what a germ was. And yet, they didn't give up. When the sun went out, they lit candles. When the crops died, they fished. When the cities fell, they built villages. When the coins became worthless, they bartered. They buried their dead, wiped the tears from their faces, and went back to work. They are the reason you are here today. If your ancestor in 536 had given up, if they had just sat down in the snow and quit, you wouldn't exist. Every single person watching this video is the descendant of a survivor. You have the DNA of the people who beat the Dark Winter. That makes you pretty tough, historically speaking. But there is also a warning here. Quiet one. We look at the Roman Empire and we see ourselves. They had paved roads. We have highways. They had aqueducts. We have plumbing. They had a global economy. We have the internet. They thought they were permanent. They thought their civilization was too big to fail. But 536 proved that civilization is fragile. It exists at the mercy of the planet. Few degrees of temperature change, a shift in the rain patterns, a microscopic bacteria. That is all it took to bring the mightiest empire on Earth to its knees. We tend to think that because we have iPhones and airplanes, we are safe from nature. But we aren't. We still need the rain to fall in the right places. We still need the sun to shine. we still need the climate to be stable. The dark winter is a reminder that we are guests on this planet, not the landlords. The volcano in Iceland is quiet now. The glaciers are holding on to their secrets. The rats are mostly behaving themselves. But the history is there, waiting for us to learn from it. It tells us that the world can change in the blink of an eye. But it also tells us that no matter how dark the winter gets, the spring always comes back. The sun always rises. The Roman Empire fell, but humanity rose. So the next time you walk outside on a sunny day, do me a favor. Feel the warmth on your face. Look at the blue sky. And just take a second to appreciate it. Because 1,500 years ago, people would have given all the gold in the world just to see what you are seeing right now. This has been the story of the worst year to be alive. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Now go enjoy the sun. Scene end.